Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mehmet Oz, Professor of Surgery, Columbia University, and Iván Duque Márquez, President, Republic of Colombia.
Very much. So we've got a wonderful session planned for you. And I'm going to start actually not talking about traditional Chinese medicine, although that is a topic that demands a lot of attention and we'll spend a fair amount of time on it. But since I've got President Duqué with me, and he is presiding over a country that has been affected by COVID like all have, but in particular the Mu variant, which many of you have not heard of yet. But it's typical that you have a lot of fast-breaking health information occurring, and as the president, you've got to deal with that. So give us your perspective on the Mu variant, which is present in many U.S. states, but was first identified in Colombia. How has that affected Colombia? And as a president, how do you deal with multiple incoming flows of information?
Doctor, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, and you know how much I admire your work. And I should say this, since day one when we were facing the pandemic, since there was no playbook for this, I made a decision. Whatever we're going to do has to be based on science, not on politics. So we created an advisory team with very well qualified medical doctors and also with our health institute in Colombia. So we do on a permanent basis genetic research on variants that could take place in Colombia. So we understood, for example, when we identified Delta last year, we started to do a lot of prevention, and the same with Mu. And I think maybe when we had the third peak that was very strong, maybe we could have had a combination between Delta and Mu, but what we did was to work since day one with the World Health Organization to identify what kind of mutations and what kind of effects it could have on patients. So far, I think we have been able to control the evolution because we made a lot of a pedagogy so that there's a better behavior in the citizens. And as of today, and that's something that keeps us a little bit happy this week, is that we have the lowest active cases, lowest mortality, lower positivity, maybe in more than a year.
Congratulations, by the way, for accomplishing tasks that have been challenges for many countries. But I'm going to go back and push you on the reality that science changes very quickly.
Yes.
In medicine, we're used to it. We actually, there was a famous line when Henry Kissinger was being evaluated to be Secretary of State, and the Senate confirmation hearing culminated with a question about whether he had enough experience in politics. And he lowered his glasses and he said, "Young man, I'm on the faculty at Harvard. That's politics." So when you have people who've spent their whole life fighting about whether the science means go left or go right, trying to share their wisdom with you, it's not always easy if you should go left or right. So how did you triage moments when there wasn't a unanimous opinion about, do you wear a mask? Does everyone get vaccinated? Do you get a booster now? Just this week in this country, we had that challenge.
I saw what was happening in China, and I saw what was happening in Europe, and that was maybe at the end of 2019, early 2020. And I called my team from the health sector, and I said, I'm worried that this could turn into a pandemic. And I did that on the 2nd of January, and it looked very far.
The 2nd of January?
2nd of January. And I'll tell you this story. When I was working at the IDB 14 years ago, I saw the H1N1, and I started reading about...
Here in Washington?
I was living in the States, and I started reading about pandemics. So I bought this book that was called The Great Influenza, about the Spanish disease, how it hit the United States, how it hit other countries. So I always had that in mind. I called the Vice Minister of Health, 2nd of January 2020, and we designed a strategy that was prevention, then contention, and then mitigation. So we stayed for around 5 weeks with the prevention mechanism. Then when we saw what was happening in Europe, we detected the first case, mitigation. And then we got a call from the director of the Health Institute in Colombia, and she said, we might lose 125,000 people in the next 4 weeks if we don't act now.
Ooh.
Because she made, with the curve
model,
the curve model analysis. So we had to make the hardest decision ever, which was the lockdown. But it had to be an intelligent lockdown so that we can have activity, economic activity happening and introduce biosecurity protocols. Yeah. So we did that. And the challenging thing is we had 5,300 ICUs, but we had to expand the capacity, and it was almost impossible to buy ventilators. But in fact, we were able to pass from 5,300 to 13,000 within approximately 12 to 14 weeks. That was something unbelievable. And then to start doing all the prevention in the country. And I think we were able to manage, and nobody had an ICU left behind. Everybody had the capability to be attended.
So the ICU is one end of the medical spectrum, but historically when people got sick, they would go home from the doctor's office with a treatment, an antibiotic for pneumonia, right? Or a medication if you had psoriasis, whatever it was required. With COVID, we didn't send you home with anything except a diagnosis, which created lots of angst, and people started looking for different ways of helping themselves. Now we know that some things made a lot of sense. Vitamin D, hugely effective. With losing weight, takes you out of the high risk category, treating your diabetes and your high blood pressure more effectively. But there are also lots of approaches that have historically been valuable for humans, just allowing themselves to be able to cope with stress more effectively. So in Colombia, what are the traditional healing techniques? Explain to me how a typical person living in a middle-aged community and a middle-income community in Colombia finds their old family remedies.
There was something very important, doctor. 95% of the people that had COVID in Colombia never went to a hospital, ever, because they could be treated at home. They could be treated at home, they were treated at home. And that was very important because the pressure, for example, on ICUs was much different. Yep. And I think that explains a lot of things that we identified in our own population. The other thing is that mortality rate was highly concentrated of people with pre-existing conditions above 70. So that's why we also did a lot of pedagogy on protecting the elder, and at the same time—
Was that 80%, 90% of the deaths, did you know?
Approximately 80%, above 70. And then we have people above 50, from 50 to 70, that also have pre-existing conditions, right, primarily diabetes. Right. So I think that also helped us identify how should we attend. And obviously, we use regular medicine for colds, for example, that were used in that 95% of the population, and we had a quick recovery period. Mm-hmm. So that was the way we managed it. But we also identified that in some communities, other techniques were able to be discussed. Even though they were not traditional medicine, we respected the cosmovision of some communities, and we tried also to involve them in the prevention side of facing the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I think that was also important because indigenous communities don't regularly believe in traditional medicine. And for example, when it came up to the vaccines, they were a little reluctant, but they understood that with the right pedagogy, we could integrate the prevention from their theories and also the practical application of the vaccine.
So moving past COVID, what are the most well or widely used medicines that are not medicines, I should say, traditional treatments that are used in Colombia? I mean, I was sharing backstage that my daughters love going to Colombia for the music. So music therapy might be one version of this, but I suspect there's some herbs, there are probably other traditions that are maybe not as well known in North America.
It depends on the region, but we had, for example, in the Pacific basin of the country, we had traditions from Afro-descendants, and they use, for example, special fruits, or they use special plants. And it's also to manage other type of diseases, for example, chikungunya, yes, which you treated with traditional medicine. Those communities are used to treat chikungunya with their own herbs. And it was interesting for us to understand how they could be used, for example, if people had a respiratory disease in areas where it was difficult to get medicine. Mm-hmm. In the Amazonic region, some of the indigenous communities also have used herbs to attend other type of diseases. For example, one that is very common in those areas is called leishmaniasis, which is an invasion of the skin that can destruct the cells very fast. Yes. They use certain herbs, and that cures leishmaniasis. So you have to—
So leishmaniasis has herbal cures that are used in Colombia?
Yes. The indigenous communities have used those techniques. It doesn't mean that it works 100% on 100% of the patients, but they have used it. And even people, for example, that were in the military, that were highly exposed to leishmaniasis, once they didn't have the medicine 10 years, 15 years ago, they used some of the herbs with the indigenous communities and it worked for them. So in Colombia, we have to create confidence between traditional medicine and also the knowledge that comes from these communities that have been there for centuries. If you build the bond, if you build the confidence, I think it's a good way to have a better understanding on how to use both sides of medicine.